Greetings. Who are experts? Put briefly, experts are people who know what they're talking about on some particular subject. An expert on nuclear physics is someone who has spent years studying physics, and then studying nuclear physics in particular, so that when it comes to nuclear physics, you listen to him. He knows what he's talking about. An expert on polymer chemistry is someone who has spent years studying chemistry, and then studying polymer chemistry in particular, so that when it comes to polymer chemistry, you listen to him. He knows what he's talking about. If you want to know something about nuclear physics, ask a nuclear physicist. He knows what he's talking about. If you want to know something about polymer chemistry, ask a polymer chemist. He knows what he's talking about. That's what makes an expert an expert. He spends years studying his subject, and in particular, studying his area of specialization. He's taken the time to learn what you and I don't know. On that subject, he knows what he's talking about. Maybe he knows what he's talking about on some other subject. Maybe he doesn't. But on the subject in which he's an expert, he knows what he's talking about. He's not necessarily the person who speaks the loudest on television. He's not necessarily the person who convinces the most people to vote for him for public office. He's not necessarily the person in the highest position of authority. We should not mistake authority for expertise. The expert is the person who knows what he's talking about in the subject area on which he's an expert. He's like the A student in high school algebra who knows how to factor and who has the quadratic formula memorized and who gets A's on all of his algebra tests and quizzes. Whether you like him or not, he's the guy you ask if you need last-minute help before taking an algebra test. He's the guy you listen to because you know that he knows what he's talking about, at least when it comes to high school algebra. Of course, it's also important to be the right kind of expert in a particular situation. It's not just that if you have a problem with your house's wiring, you don't call a plumber. The plumber might well be an expert about how to treat a clogged drain, but for a problem with your house's wiring, you call an electrician. But it's not just that. It's also that if you have a problem with your foot, you don't just see any old doctor. You don't, for example, see an ear, nose, and throat specialist. You go to a podiatrist because he has expert knowledge on the health of the foot and on the treatment of problems with the foot. If you want to know how to react to a global pandemic, you don't ask a radiologist. You ask someone whose expertise is in infectious diseases and public health. It's important to consult the right kind of expert. Moreover, it's often important to find out the consensus of experts. Some matters, even for experts, are matters of judgment, and there isn't universal agreement among them. Some matters are not so well settled among the relevant experts that you'll get the same answer no matter which one you ask. There's a reason for the old joke that if you laid all the world's economists end to end, they'd point in different directions. Sometimes there's not only disagreement among experts, but important disagreement. Not because they aren't all well informed, but because even being well informed doesn't imply being omniscient, even within one's chosen field of study. And sometimes there's room for reasonable disagreement among those who know what they're talking about. But where matters are well settled among the experts, it's because they've hashed it out in journal articles, in meetings with each other, and in their own private deliberations. But despite their own very human tendencies to find new and creative ways of disagreeing, all of them, with the possible exception of a few contrarian outliers, will agree. And when that happens, that contributes to giving you your most accurate picture of the world. And it can give you your best understanding of which policies ought to be followed, which agencies created, and which laws passed. So, if there were a consensus among astronomers that an asteroid was headed directly toward Earth, you'd want to follow a policy of doing something about that asteroid rather than a policy of ignoring it. It's different if there's no consensus. But where there is, you should pay attention to it. Obviously, it's best if you can make yourself an expert so as to judge for yourself instead of having to listen to anyone else, even if the people you're listening to do know what they're talking about. But no one can make himself an expert on everything, and when you find out about that asteroid, you don't have time to become an astronomer yourself. You have to rely on the people who have taken the time to become astronomers. Unfortunately, I live in a society many of whose members distrust experts, so that they would disagree with my second reason for voting Democratic, namely that I want my elected representatives to listen to the consensus of the relevant experts when proposing policies, creating agencies, or passing laws. Perhaps they would prefer to fail their algebra tests rather than ask the A student for help. I think it is really, really important that we understand what it means to be an expert on a particular subject. It means that you know what you're talking about. That's it, very simply. It means that you know what you're talking about. And I think it's really, really important that we understand what it means when there is a consensus view among the experts. It means that reasonable, well-informed people on whatever the subject is have reached a general agreement on what is and is not so, on what the facts are, and, if it's relevant, what the implications of the facts are. Those of us who are not experts on the particular subject should then endorse that consensus view, even if we privately retain doubts about it, because that view is the view of the ones who have the best, most well-informed understanding of the matter. Essentially, they know better than we do on the particular topic. If you want to disagree with an economist about plumbing, go ahead, but don't disagree with them about the law of supply and demand. We should have a certain degree of trust in our experts, and especially in the consensus of experts. Consensus of experts. You might not like thinking that some people know better than you do, but they do. Polymer chemists know better about polymer chemistry than I do, too. And we're long past the age when it was possible to claim expertise about everything. We all have to rely on other people to be experts in subjects about which we ourselves are not experts. And we all have to rely on the consensus of experts to tell us what reasonable, well-informed people think is true, or likely to be true. One thing to be careful about: not everything is a matter of expertise, and we should distinguish between what is and what isn't. If beauty is truly in the eye of the beholder, then nobody can tell you which painting is the most beautiful, because there isn't one. There's only which painting you consider most beautiful, which painting I consider most beautiful, which painting my neighbor considers the most beautiful, and so on. Or a priest might be an expert on what the biblical text says, but unless God exists, and unless the priest has a direct line to God, he can't tell us what God wants from us, because he doesn't know any better than anyone else does. He can only tell you what the biblical text says. Not everything is a matter of expertise, and we should distinguish between what is and what is not. And we should recognize when someone is claiming expertise in a matter about which there cannot be expertise. Nevertheless, when we are dealing with some subject matter about which it is possible to be an expert, we should listen to the consensus of the experts, precisely because if it were reasonable for the best informed people to disagree with that consensus, there probably wouldn't be a consensus. As always, may reason and compassion be your guides.